Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to this panel on U.S. leadership in the Middle East, threats and challenges. We have an extraordinary panel with us, a great deal of ground to cover, so let's take it away. Our four panelists, in no particular order, are Dan Shapiro, the former American ambassador to Israel, now a visiting fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, David Makovsky, who is the director of the Project for Arab-Israel Relations at the Washington Institute and a former senior advisor at the State Department for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. Mary Beth Long, who is the founder of Global Alliance Advisors and a former Assistant Secretary of Defense. And John Rood, the former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. So welcome, everybody. The first question I have to ask you, is the United States pivoting away from the region? Pivoting away from Israel, even. We've heard the president saying the desire not to be involved in these endless wars. Maybe America doesn't need oil so much from this part of the world, and therefore it's less energy dependent. Maybe it feels terror is a declining threat. John, maybe let's start with you on that.
David, it's great to be with you, and I don't see the United States pivoting away from the region or especially from Israel. The relationship with Israel remains extremely close. In fact, I think in its present state, it's arguably as close as it's been in decades. So I don't see the United States pivoting away from the Israel relationship. I do think that there is a growing concern about what is going on in Asia, and that applies itself in terms of China's influence in the Middle East as well. There is a strong desire that I think is felt across the bipartisan spectrum here in the United States to see the United States take a much more active role in dealing with some of the problematic behavior that we see emanating from China, to address some of the most concerning behaviors of the Chinese Communist regime. But I don't see that occurring, and witness the fact when the president talks about withdrawing from endless wars, remember some of these, such as U.S. involvement in Iraq, U.S. involvement in places like Syria, there's going to continue to be a U.S. presence even if troop levels are withdrawn, and we haven't always had those troop levels there in places like Iraq. But witness the fact that the administration is willing to take decisive action on Qasem Soleimani to work to broker this historic agreement with the United Arab Emirates. I don't see the U.S. Retreating from the region, but rather just adjusting how it is approaching in some tactical ways.
Dan Shapiro, do you want to weigh in on this?
Sure. Well, thank you. It's great to be with everybody on the panel. I agree with John very much that the commitment to the U.S.-Israel partnership is strong, it's enduring, it's bipartisan. It has essentially continued on a steady upward trajectory through multiple administrations. And we've seen in the recent years how the U.S.-Israeli partnership has served as U.S. interests in helping enable Israel to deal with threats it faces, such as Iran's presence in Syria, that also affect U.S. interests. And so I don't see any real diminution of that commitment. Of course, there's a strong security assistance agreement only in its early years that will carry forward for the next decade and continue to strengthen that partnership. I do think, however, there is a broader desire on the part of the American public, and it's been felt by the last two administrations, the Obama and the Trump administrations, in different ways, to gradually reduce the U.S. Certainly active military presence in the region. Doesn't mean withdrawing all troops from the Gulf or all partnerships with other nations, but it does mean trying to end the U.S. military involvement and prevent new involvements in places like Iraq and Syria. And it does mean trying to ensure that partners in the region will carry as much of the weight as possible for their own security needs. And that does overlap with what John referenced, which was an increasing focus on other regions, on Asia in particular, on the challenge that China presents, and not wanting to necessarily have to devote too much attention and resources to a region where, as you also stated, David, there may be some decline in at least the energy needs that the United States derives from that. The last thing I'll just add on this opening comment is that there is also tension between the United States and some of its regional partners about their own conduct in addressing internal matters or in addressing some of those very regional challenges. Witness the bipartisan condemnation of Saudi Arabia's tactics in the war it's conducted in Yemen, or concerns that have been expressed about various partners, Turkey, UAE, Egypt, their participation in Libya, or concerns that at least you might hear in a Biden administration about human rights in Egypt and in Saudi Arabia. So I do think that these are going to continue to be points that potentially cause at least some tensions between the U.S. and regional partners, even as the core commitment to their security and to preventing Iran's aggression, preventing a broader Russian expansion of influence, and stabilizing our allies' security will remain.
Thank you. Mary Beth, you share the sort of robust sense there of ongoing American commitment. As we look at that from an Israeli point of view, that's crucial to us, obviously.
I do. I think I would nuance it just a little bit. I mean, there are things that people are seeing that we can't deny that are reflective of a change in focus, I think, of the American population. And some people will interpret that as being away from the Middle East. Certainly, there'll be no change in our commitment to Israel, and no change as to our commitment of the freedom of navigation and other security concerns that the Middle East represents, whether or not we're there. I think there'll be a change in the kind of presence. Maybe the numbers are what people focus on. I think it's the kind of presence that's more important. But there is a redistribution of assets, not just away from Middle East, if you want to say it in that way. But I think that the American public and this administration, but more important, even beyond this administration, are looking differently at the kinds of troops and the kinds of presence we have. And that's indicative of what we're doing in Europe as well as in the Far East. So when it comes to peer-to-peer conflict, we are focused somewhat more Eastern in a more Eastern manner, but from a core values and core interest standpoint, we're as much committed to the Middle East as ever, because the Middle East presents, in many respects, many of the problems that we still have yet to conquer.
Thank you. David, your turn for this opening round. And, maybe take the question a little bit forward. Does it change depending on who wins the next elections in the United States? Or is the commitment abiding, permanent?
Yeah. Look, I think, I don't know, Dan said it. What's really interesting here is the commonality between two administrations in a row that Israelis don't often see. And that is this sense of retrenchment. I think we're hearing it from our panelists in a certain way, that the U.S. basically has fewer troops in the Middle East, but whether it's in Afghanistan, Syria, or Iraq, Syria, these are basically at levels that are sustainable. And it is, low cost. U.S. has not really sustained casualties in any serious way. It has been assuring to our allies that we're there, and I think this is reduced instability. It could put a check on America's adversaries as well. I know some people say, well, energy independence, America with the fracking doesn't need the Middle East. America doesn't want disruptions in the global economy, and clearly our allies are very dependent on Middle Eastern oil. So here too, I think it's been at a very sustainable price for the United States in terms of our projection of naval power and the like. So I think it's you could say a sweet spot in a certain way, and this sense of retrenchment does not mean withdrawal. It just doesn't mean the same robust levels maybe at the time of the first Gulf War, but it's at a level that is still assuring to our allies. And I think a bonus for us in America is that what it used to be when our allies were much more at loggerheads with each other, the Gulf and Israel, now the Gulf and Israel are getting closer. So there's no friction point there the way there was. I'm not trying to paint too rosy a picture. I'm just saying, I see the news commentary in Israel, and I think that, it's always America's leaving tomorrow. It's over. It's not. And I think it's bipartisan, to, this sense of retrenchment, but at the same time, I don't see the clamor. The president said, I'd love to bring all the troops home. All American presidents say that. But the truth is that despite what this president has said, American troops do remain in the region, and I don't see that changing. Will there be different points of emphasis, going forward. I think Dan's point, probably you'll see some of that if in a Biden administration. Dan mentioned human rights, the Yemeni war, although here there's been more bipartisanship, the issue of JCPOA, that'll be, I'm sure, something we will discuss. The Iran nuclear deal will be revived. So I'm not here to say that there's full agreement on everything, but I don't see, America pulling the plug on its commitments to its allies' security in the Middle East.
Okay, thank you, David. I want to come back to you, Dan Shapiro, now. David mentioned something about the reducing friction between Israel and the Gulf. I mean, even more so, we're in the beginning, apparently, of what we hope will be a widening circle of peace for Israel that's begun with the United Arab Emirates. Dan, as I say, first to you, is this some kind of strategic change? I mean, it's not peace with an immediate neighbor, but it's America brokering peace with players in this region who have common interests with Israel, who don't have a bloody history with Israel, and who are proving, the possibility of a trend of countries putting the Palestinians aside or normalizing with Israel before the Palestinian conflict has been solved. What do you make of this?
Well, it's very welcome as a broader development in the region. It's been a long-term, bipartisan strategic objective of, again, multiple administrations to achieve normalization, certainly to advance toward normalization between Israel and Arab states. Now, the Arab states had, since the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative, declared that they saw the sequence as being first a two-state solution with the between Israel and the Palestinians, and then normalization. That was their position, and that was the framework within which previous administrations worked. Obviously, the United Arab Emirates has decided to change that sequence. And again, the normalization itself is very welcome. It derives from the shared threat of Iran and some other threats, Sunni jihadist movements as well, especially Iran, that the UAE and Israel identify and have been cooperating on quietly for many, many years. And much of that cooperation has been encouraged and even shepherded to a degree by previous administrations as well. It derives from, as you said, perhaps a diminishing sense that there are prospects for a two-state solution, or maybe diminishing interest or commitment to the Palestinian issue on the part of some Arab governments. And of course, there may be additional normalization agreements yet to come. As we speak, Secretary of State Pompeo is in the region. He has some other stops on his itinerary in Gulf countries and maybe other countries, and it may be that others will follow the UAE lead. And so that's all very much to be encouraged. It's encouraging because of the opportunities, economic and scientific and security, all those fields of cooperation that Israel and the UAE and others can advance on. Obviously, it's always good for the United States when our partners are working together against common threats. And what I hope it will be the case is that the United States will try to build on that progress as a basis for a renewed effort to achieve an Israeli-Palestinian accommodation and a two-state solution. What would worry me would be if the conclusion that is drawn from these developments is that the Palestinian issue doesn't matter and it can be pushed to the side, or it can be solved with unilateral measures like Israeli annexation in the West Bank, which is not a solution. Nothing in the Trump plan that was presented in January really presents a two-state solution that will ensure Israel retains its Jewish and democratic character. That's important for its own identity. It's important for its security. That's important for its values-based partnership with the United States. And that Palestinians will achieve their rights of self-determination and dignity in the state of their own. Those are going to still be essential goals to achieving the long-term stability in the region, the long-term stability of Israel's character and the U.S.-Israel alliance, and of course, Palestinian aspirations. So I think it's going to be very important to build on this progress, but in a way that does not seem to shunt aside simply because the sequence has been changed, the two-state solution that has always been the core goal in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Great. David, can I ask you to come in on that? You've followed the Israeli-Palestinian conflict most of your life. How are we going to see this now? Is the United States going? I mean, there's tremendous optimism from the president that the Palestinians will yet engage. and he's optimistic in the face of complete Palestinian rejection, accusations of betrayal being delivered by Ramallah to those who are moving to normalize. Where do you see the United States trying to move that process now, and do you see Israel going along?
Right. Well, I think this is a seismic moment, and it has enormous potential. You know, as Dan said, I mean, we're seeing America's allies come together around common interests in a way that we have not seen in the past, whether the issue is Iran, whether it's dealing with ISIS, jihadis, whether it's dealing with, other forms of militancy. I mean, this is, I think, good news for America. To see its friends in the Middle East that used to be at such odds, and it's been under the table, but now there's no more table, and that's a good thing. So there's a convergence in their regional thinking, bringing these two countries together, and that's really positive. And just to see our friends come together. I mean, look at the Emirati Sovereign Wealth Fund. Has been valued, maybe now with COVID and the drop in oil, it's a little less, but still it's been over $1 trillion investing in high-tech companies, and Israel is known as the startup nation. I saw the Prime Minister of Israel just do a press conference where he talked about Emirati infrastructure projects. This is something we never saw in Israel. We never saw this in any of these peace treaties that Israel's had before. And it obviously had other benefits because those countries were in a state of war with Israel. But this is a potential windfall, maybe one of the greatest moments for Israel since the Soviet Jewish Aliyah in terms of its potential impact. Now, on the Palestinian dimension, I completely agree with Dan that the question for me is this a bypass road or a bridge? And I can see people say it's a bypass road. I think that's a terrible mistake. The Palestinians are right at Israel's doorstep. A one-state solution would create a lot of problems for Israel everywhere, including, I fear, in the United States. Maybe we could discuss this later. But my fear is that the Palestinians in the short term are just in a state of shock, and there's anger, and there's probably the Abbas reticence, don't do anything, we'll see what happens after the election in the United States. So I have no expectations, David, to your question, that the Palestinians will somehow utilize the moment. Even if Trump said publicly what he promised the Emiratis, no annexation in a second Trump term. And I don't think that the Emiratis felt they had to extract that from Biden because he's against annexation. But I say, instead of cursing MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, the leader of the Emirates, I wish the Palestinians would coax MBZ, not curse him. By the way, the frostiness between the Emirates and the Palestinians predates this. It deals with Mohammed Dahlan, a rival of Abbas who lives in Abu Dhabi, and other factors. But the point is that, there's a Sheikh Zayed city in Gaza built by the Emiratis, and there could be cities in the West Bank too. The idea is to coax the Emiratis in instead of curse them, because what we've noticed with Egypt and Jordan is something fascinating, is once these countries do make peace with Israel, they actually have a stake in broadening the circle of peace because they don't want to be politically exposed. So I see it as an opportunity. I really do agree it's a shift in paradigm, and that is also a shock for the Palestinians because they assume that the Arab states were their leverage. But what's interesting about the Middle East, it's not the Middle East of 2003 when the Arab Peace Initiative was passed. There wasn't ISIS then. There wasn't Iran in the region in the same way. There wasn't cyber as a key component of intelligence in the same way. And these countries just don't want to put their interests on hold for a generation anymore. So I think that we should realize they need a new paradigm. But anyone who thinks this means the Palestinian issue is not important to Israel or to the United States, I think is wrong. But the key is to use the Emirates instead of to curse them. And I don't expect the Palestinians, however, to seize on that at this moment. They're going to wait to see how the dust settles. I think a new administration is going to want to re-engage, but maybe not in trying to hit the home run ball, not trying to run the marathon, but trying to run the 5K race. Do something gradually, but that would keep hopes for two states alive. I do think the Venn diagram between Abbas and Netanyahu don't precisely overlap to make a final status deal possible. And I think Palestinian succession means during succession, you don't compete on who is more accommodating with Israel, but who is more pure. So I don't believe a grand deal is in the offing, but that whenever it's all or nothing in the Mideast, it's nothing. And there has to be gradualism, and I expect the new administration to engage as well. And the Palestinians now won't, but I think we have to look ahead beyond, January of next year.
All right, thank you, David. Let's move on to Iran. You mentioned it there. Again, the president said, not too long ago, he thinks that Iran would even come in and make peace in the Middle East. No remote signal to that effect coming from Tehran. And so really, I want to come to John and Mary Beth on this. Iran agitates continually for the demise of Israel. We believe they're bent on obtaining a nuclear weapons arsenal. And let me start with you, John. Do you think that the United States has presented, is capable of presenting a credible military threat to deter Iran from proceeding with its nuclear program?
The United States certainly is capable of presenting that sort of deterrent effect. And what you've seen in the last year is a continuation of a much more assertive U.S. policy in countering Iran. This maximum pressure campaign has done unprecedented damage to the Iranian economy, put them under stress that they've never seen before, and it's reduced their ability to spread the revolution, to spread their malign influence around the region, to fund some of the terror groups and militant groups that they have cultivated long-standing relationships with. And the architect of that strategy, Qasem Soleimani, of course, is no longer with us. So there are a number of things that have been taken in the nuclear area, confronting that, getting out of the JCPOA, which was a fatally flawed deal. And so finding a different path has been the approach that the Trump administration has taken. And I think there is a credibility there. I agree with you. Iran and its leaders are still continuing to try to find a way towards a nuclear weapon. We have to oppose that. We have to be willing to do what is necessary to prevent. I do think, though, with all this pressure, the U.S. has done that largely unilaterally. And the main thing that I have been a little disappointed with is there are opportunities with other states who have similar concerns to broaden the sense of diplomatic isolation that Iran feels, to increase that pressure. And just pressure is not a strategy. That's a set of tactics. That's an approach. But there has to be a broader strategy. And while there's been some discussion about either a willingness for outreach or negotiations with the Iranian regime, I don't think that the State Department has put together a credible plan to accomplish that, nor executed something. I do think, though, we have to be realistic, and whether this regime in Iran would really negotiate in a serious way over those kinds of activities. But I think without two necessary conditions: one, increased pressure where you have a broader set of states participating. It's not simply unilateral U.S. economic sanctions, which have had a tremendous toll, and the world's largest economy can put great hurt on the Iranian economy. But I do think that in order to increase the pressure truly to be a point where the Iranians might find it necessary to negotiate, you would need to have a participation of a broader coalition. And secondarily, you've got to be much more serious about pursuing some sort of diplomacy, real interchange or real negotiation with the regime than has occurred to date. I do not think if former Vice President Biden is elected president, I do expect his administration would pursue a attempt to revive the JCPOA, but I just don't think that agreement will get you to the destination that the Obama administration hoped it would. And the track record was that it was not moderating Iran's behavior. In fact, it was providing the resources for Iran to up its aggression in the region.
Mary Beth, can I come to you on that same point? I'll just add in there, there was an effort by the United States at the Security Council to extend the international arms embargo, almost no support for the United States. So in terms of the dilemmas of acting unilaterally when really needing wider international support, that doesn't look promising. And then, tell us a little bit more how you think maybe the United States should engage, can engage with Iran more effectively.
Well, actually, I have two comments along those lines. I am involved in Iran Track 2 negotiations and met with the Iranians probably 7 or 8 times in the last 2 years. And while the U.S. is capable of deterring Iran from developing or using a nuclear weapon, I think that there's a lot of question of whether or not the American people and the two parties that are controlling our politics are willing to do so. So the fact of the matter is, I have to say that I agree with this president in that there doesn't seem to be any real reason to negotiate with the Iranians above and beyond what's going on with the State Department and in private track 2 until the Iranians show some willingness or desire to negotiate with us. And the democratic continued overtures to the Iranians and key Iranian officials over the 4 years, as well as the looming U.S. elections, only further embolden the Iranians to wait it out and see what in fact will happen, whether we will go back to a defensive posture where we basically look away from the missile programs and a lot of the important regional activities of Iran to focus solely on the nuclear question, allowing them to deploy their forces abroad and to arguably control or have substantial influence in the region that it did not have prior to the mid 2010, 2015, or whether the Iranians will be held to task. From a European standpoint, I think your point on the UN and the rest of the world is exactly right. When we have a government such as Iran that has, I think at this point, no one can really argue, taken advantage of the last decade or so in invading other countries, controlling them, sending their troops abroad, unprecedented terrorist activities in the Strait of Hormuz and other places. And then you have the majority of the world, or certainly the UN Security Council, not even willing, given all the violations of UN accords and of agreements that Iran has made, not even willing to restrict their access to conventional weaponry. I'm not sure that the U.S. interests when it comes to holding Iran to the standards of which responsible nations conduct themselves is shared with too much of the rest of the world. So you have to have a partner in which you're going to have shared interests. And I think at this point, for good or for ill, it's very unclear where the U.S. partners are when it comes to Iran. And on the GCC, I want to return for just a moment. I know there's a lot of happiness, and it's truly unprecedented and very brave of Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, the UAE's leadership, and the Israelis for this accord. But I think there's a bit of clarity that we need to look at here about how much of this is really about the Palestinians, how much of this is about the West Bank and Arab decisions perhaps to make this move when they made it for fear of annexation and what that will do to long-term prospects of Israeli recognition as well as the Palestinian issues, and the immediate tactical considerations of the UAE in making this move now. Everybody knows or should know that for the last decade, the leadership of the UAE has been passing out books of Entrepreneur Nation. They have had a tremendous amount of overtures with the Israelis at the senior most levels, as well as in commercial and in bio and development, et cetera, some of which I have had a role in. But this particular move at this particular time, not to take anything away from the administration and anything away from the UAE, was as much about the UAE getting itself in hot water with the US about the Chinese and about failure to make progress on Joint Strike Fighter, and starting to see leaks from the administration and the Defense Department about real concerns about UAE and China and the implications of that, and this being a tremendous play on their part to basically wipe that out of the front of the papers and to put the State Department and the U.S. Defense Department on notice that they were willing to do this in order to buy them time and perhaps grace on the Chinese issue, and to get Joint Strike Fighter to at least position itself perhaps in a favorable motion, and to avoid the problem of not having made these moves with a possible change of administrations where they needed to get what they can out of this administration before a possible Democratic administration is elected, where they wouldn't have the traction. They wouldn't get the credit for recognizing Israel before Trump goes for his elections, and everything would be back on the table for Biden. So this was a very, very, very wily maneuver by the UAE, and I applaud both of them for that. It's not so much about the Palestinians. Let's not fool ourselves.
All right. I have to tell you, that was a fascinating answer. I guess the mark of a good panel is that people don't want it to end. I would like to keep going, but we're out of time. I want to thank all four of our panelists, Dan Shapiro, David Makovsky, John Rood, Mary Beth Long. I look forward to having a longer conversation with you in the future. Take care, everybody. Be well, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.